Okay, now we're thrilled to present Alan Cheuse and Joyce Carol Oates, two very prolific writers. Alan is Moments fiction editor and longtime NPR book critic. He's the author of 5 novels, 4 collections of short fiction, and a memoir. His stories have been in The New Yorker, Plowshares, The Antioch Review, and other places. He teaches in the writing program at George Mason University and the Squaw Valley Community of Writers. Why don't you come on up? Thank you. And we're so honored to have Joyce Carol Oates tonight. She's one of the most renowned contemporary writers. She's written more than 40 novels and has received the National Book Award, the Penn Malamud Award, the National Humanities Medal, and many more honors. We're very deeply honored to have her here tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, Joyce. Good evening. Do you remember the McCarthy days when this guy would get on front of Congress and say, I have here a sheaf of names of all the communists in the U.S. Senate and Congress? This is a list of Joyce's books. It's much better to err on the side of the novel than of bad politics. But actually, what I have here, Joyce, is the 1976 Paris Review interview with you.
Not sure I remember it.
Well, you've lived another entire life as a writer since that interview came out. I mean, those interviews are announce that a writer has arrived in one way or another. And you've published so much since then that they're long overdue for another one, I think. But I was amazed at that time when you said, well, Robert Phillips, the interviewer, said, well, are you writing new stories? And you say, no, I think I'll focus on some novels. I'm not sure. I think I may have finished with stories.
Oh, did I say that?
Yeah, right. And since then, you've published some of the most astonishing short stories in American literature. And I'm reminded of, when I think of the story that you write and the novel that you write, I don't know if anybody said this to you before. Can I say something this intimate on stage? But Lawrence and Hardy are the writers who come to my mind who work beautiful stories but aren't really known for their stories. They're known for their huge novels. But
especially not Hardy.
Yeah. And where is your heart these days with stories and novels?
Well, I really love to write both short stories and novels. I love to read these forms, and I think writing, and I'm sure you would agree, Alan, the writing is derived from the happiness of reading. When we're very young and we start off reading, or somebody reads to us, it just fills you with such excitement that you naturally want to do your own stories.
Yes.
So that's how I think of it, and I read short stories all the time. And I teach at Princeton University, and my students are writing stories, and some of my students are trying to write novels, and so I'm reading all the time, and I really enjoy it. I love just reading sentences. Anything that's authentic and serious, I really relate to. The kind of writing that I can't relate to is when it's just very satirical or very light or not serious or insincere.
Yeah, I find it hard to read comedy when there's... What
right,
about you?
Unless it's a sort of melancholy, bittersweet comedy, like Lori Moore writes.
That's
different.
That's different. That's different. She's got a new book of stories coming out.
Yes, I'm reading it right now.
Reading.
I've read most of it. Yes.
The world is waiting for that one.
Yes.
And you have a new novel coming in January.
Yes. Well, I've been working on other things. You said, "Where is my heart now?" And my heart is with what I'm working on right now, because you get sort of focused on what's in front of you, and that's what I tend to be thinking about.
And your heart has undergone many transformations, and it's been in many places.
I suppose that's so, but to be a writer or any kind of artist, you have to really focus very intensely. And so it's the intensity that we bring to our dreams at night. Like each night we fall asleep and we sort of descend into this magical underworld, And the dreams that we experience are so intense and so involving, sometimes frightening, that they are completely enveloping us. Like you don't think, well, I've had 40,000 dreams before. You don't think about that. You're just sort of involved in this one intense experience, and that's the way the writing is. So if you've written 40 books before, or 5 books or whatever, it doesn't really make any difference because you put your heart into what you're doing right now.
Your family encouraged you to write at a rather early age.
Well, my grandmother encouraged me. I had a Jewish grandmother, and
All right, well, we've got that.
we didn't know that she was Jewish. She was from a family that came from somewhere in Germany in the 1890s, and they disguised their identity and came to upstate New York, western New York. Now, why anybody would willingly go up there where it's so cold, I have no idea. They sort of wanted to put a lot of distance between themselves and places that they might have lived, like Jewish areas in New York City or Boston. They would have been at home, but they went to this relative wilderness, which is upstate New York. I'm not being funny, actually. It's called the Snow Belt, and we lived out in the country, and it is relatively wilderness. Today it's a little more developed, of course. But I went to a one-room schoolhouse, and so my grandmother, who was Jewish, was the person who bought books for me, took me to the library in the city. We lived on a farm. It's all kind of complicated because I had Hungarian grandparents, but my Jewish grandmother lived in the city. And then she was the person who got me 2 typewriters. One was a toy typewriter, the little thing that you turned around. Do anybody remember them?
Yes.
Not many of us remember them anymore. You turn it around, because now babies got their own computers and they're the iPads when they're just in the crib, perhaps. But did you ever have one of these, Alan? Do you know what I mean?
No.
You're too young.
Yeah.
He's too young. Can't take you.
Thank you, Joyce.
How could I take you seriously when you're so young? Anyway, it was a toy where you turned this carriage around and then you pushed it and you get the letter T, and you pushed it around the letter H, and that way you could write War and Peace. If you just took a long enough time and so forth. So my grandmother gave me that, and then a few years later, or 5 or 10 years later, when I was 14, she gave me a manual typewriter.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't know that they were manual then. We thought this was a typewriter. Little did we know that one day there would be an electric typewriter, and little did we know that there'd be computers and all that. We had no idea. But to give a child of 14 who lives in the country a typewriter at that time was really astonishing. I'm sure I was the only one in the whole county who had a typewriter. And I proceeded to start writing novels.
That's you not only were typing, but you were also at that time
writing.
Newspapers were typeset, and you were typing, and you were in tune, unbeknownst,
Typing, yes.
with the news.
Well, I was very interested in literature,
Yep.
and I was reading ever since I was about 8 or 9 or 10 when I was given Alice in Wonderland.
Mm-hmm.
So this was like a talismanic book by my grandmother, and this was so powerful, and I virtually memorized it. So I had tablets where I drew pictures, a little bit like Lewis Carroll's work, and then I graduated to the typewriter about the time when I was in 9th or 10th grade. So then I was reading Hemingway and trying to write Hemingway-inspired stories.
Did your friends know this?
Well, my friends, no, but I gave some of these stories to my teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had a phase where I was influenced by Faulkner and a phase influenced by Fitzgerald. So I was like an apprentice.
Mm-hmm.
I was sort of apprenticing myself to these great writers. But I remember how exciting that was. I just sort of pretended I was a real writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm typing away, It's really exciting. Soon there won't be anybody who remembers the excitement of putting a ribbon in, and
Yes.
threading the ribbon around and getting it all over your hands and
Yeah.
so forth. It was a particularly tactile.
That was the first typewriter that I had. When I
That with the
graduated
ribbon,
from college, my parents gave me one of these Walmart or this was before Walmart,
Spool.
yes, it was held together with twine, and you had to change the ribbon.
And we
use
use
carbon paper.
And we use carbon paper.
Use carbon paper.
Which nobody even knows about anymore.
So you could tell who the writers were. You say, hold up your hands. And then we advanced to whiteout.
I had whiteout. It was always very exciting. And when I was really little, I was drawing, and I had tablets instead of writing novels in that form. Seeing the Spiegelman exhibit was very, very moving just now, because obviously he's telling these very complex and morally resonant stories he's telling using basically the cartoon art, which is very difficult to do.
I'm going to tell you something, and I do this at my own peril, because I once said to Carlos Fuentes, when he asked what I was working on, I said, a story about Ambrose Bierce in Mexico. And then 2 years later, he sent me a copy of a novel saying, thank you for your wonderful idea.
Oh, wow.
And my wife at the time said, see, now you won't have to do that. Write a novel about Ambrose Bierce in Mexico, but which is why she was my wife at the time. But as I was walking through the Chagall, I thought, this would make a wonderful novel, this romance of the painter and his wife.
Yes, it's very powerful.
So you've probably done that already.
Well, it's probably not for me to do.
Okay,
but
then I'll take it.
I actually have a Chagall lithograph, a signed lithograph I've had for about 40 years in our house, and they're lovers, two lovers, and then there's like a starry night with a lot of sort of mystical symbols and darkness in the background. And I've looked at it thousands of times, but after seeing this exhibit, I see more in it now. The two lovers, it was obviously Chagall and his wife. And then maybe the wife was deceased at that time when he was sort of remembering her and imagining her. It's very, very powerful.
I find that writing about painters particularly is really an interesting way to discover things about one's own approaches and one's own aesthetic.
And what have you done?
My novel, based lightly on O'Keeffe and about a dozen other American and European women painters, the light possessed, allowed me to see things about my own work that I hadn't seen. I mean, when you write about writers, it's always tricky, but if you write about another artist, I think it's interesting.
Yes.
So you're in high school, and we're doing This Is Your Life, Joyce Carol's. You're in high school and doing really serious work, and your teachers must have encouraged you greatly.
Well, I had nice teachers. I always was very, very lucky to have teachers who were encouraging. First, I went to this one-room schoolhouse, which is out in the country, and it was very rough and kind of primitive. My mother had also gone there like 25 years before, and it was just one large room and one teacher and eight grades. So if you were little, the older boys were very bullying, you know. The whole idea of bullying now is very common in our society. It's talked about. There was no word for it then, but it's always gone on. So the smaller children were really intimidated by the larger, big boys. The boys didn't really want to be there. They were farm boys, and they wanted to quit school as soon as they could. They were allowed to quit when they were 16, I think, but up until that point. Some of them were really large, quite hulking, actually. So people ask me where I get my sense of evil and the predatory males and violence and so forth. Well, it just began right then. But I learned how to run because the smaller children were chased and really kind of terrorized. So I learned to run very fast, and I've always enjoyed running. I've written a lot about that school because it was such an interesting experience, and people don't know have any idea what it's like today because it was truly primitive. But on the other hand, books were so prized and so valuable. In our household, there were so few books that to me the book as an object is like an aesthetic object, and it has a sort of magical value. Whereas I think younger people today who may just be reading online don't have that same feeling for the aesthetic properties
I think that's
of the
true.
book.
I remember the first book I ever held in my hands. My father had a book in Russian called The Story of the Golden Cockerel, a Russian folktale, and he would read it to me. I didn't understand a word of it, and one of the things I hate about my own life is that I never learned Russian because my father spoke it, so why should I want to do it? But he would read this book to me, and I understood nothing, but I remember smelling the pages and have sniffed books ever since. And that's what, as you say, the current generation of readers and writers, they don't see that a book has to pass the sniff test.
Well, I can ask you a question because it's actually a sort of a general question I'm interested in. Do you think that you and other writers like yourself, do you think you'd work so very, very, very hard on your prose if it wasn't going to be in a book form, but only in ebook form?
Well, I think ebook is still a book, so I think it still holds that
Well,
same kind of goal. I would draw a line with the blog.
The blog, you wouldn't write so hard.
No.
If you were, say, James Joyce, working for 15 years on Finnegan's Wake, you just wouldn't have that motive or that impetus. When Joyce was writing, of course, the book was this beautiful aesthetic object, and it had almost a religious or sacred value in the world. But if you don't have that, I'm not sure that you'd have the same sort of motives for, say, the writings of James Joyce or Proust or Faulkner or Hemingway. They were writing for the library shelf and for the three-dimensional world. The ebook is a little more like a book, but it isn't really your book because it's an apparatus and you're like a ghost in this machine, and then you can be just sort of erased.
And the last figures that I've seen this week about ebook sales is they're going way down.
Why is that?
Nobody seems to know.
All right, well, what about hardcover books
Hardcover books are sort of holding their own.
and paperbacks?
Holding their own means where they
Yeah.
fell when the ebook landslide started, but
Well,
they're
it's
not going
sort of
down.
mysterious, isn't it? Because just recently we've had mega billion bestsellers like J.K. Rowling
Yeah.
and the 50 Shades of Grey and maybe some other, maybe Stephen King or someone. I mean, there are still people who are selling many, many, many copies of books.
But
they're out there, and I think the Rowling novels are real books. And it's amazing that young children are reading 500-page books.
But she's published this
couple of
mainstream novel, which I have to read next week for
couple of
Diane Ream's
novels.
radio show thing. But
two novels she's published.
and in a way, she had to sell millions of copies of this children's book in order to get somebody to publish the book she really cared about. It's a very strange time we live in.
Is that really what she said?
No, but that was my surmise.
Well,
You heard it here first.
just when people are saying that the book is dying, around that time the Harry Potter books started getting published, and the young people who might be considered to be people who wouldn't be reading, they're the ones who were reading them.
But, there are two strains of thought, I think. If you read, I guess this week's or last week's New York Review of Books, there's an essay by this guy, Tim Parks, who along with David Shields are advocating the end of the novel, yet another death of the novel lament. We hear that every 20, 30 years. And they're both, in a way, kind of failed or very disappointed novelists in their own right. And saying that, with tweets and ebooks and everything else that's going on electronically, that you don't have to write a novel in order to give the reader the essence of our time. On the other end of that are these surveys of college students this year and the year before, and they say, I love a physical book above anything else, and I keep the books that I love.
And they're also writing. Well, tweets are no substitute for Dickens or Dostoevsky. I write tweets. Tweets are just tweets. That's not a substitute for anything. It's like saying that an advertising jingle is a substitute for Beethoven. But I think that's true. If you had a very successful writer really, really successful writer who then said the novel's dead, then you might take it seriously. But it's never that person. It's always somebody who's disappointed.
Right, somebody on the outside. And meanwhile, these college students are saying they love the book as a physical object.
Well, they're certainly writing. I mean, you teach writing students, and
Yes.
I'm teaching them too. And my students are writing. Some of my young writers are writing novels, and they're very enthusiastic, and they're very thoughtful. I'm sure it's the case with your students. They're very supportive and tender toward one another in the workshop. You know, they really identify with one another, and we spend time before we get to their work. We spend time, for instance, today on Faulkner and Scott Fitzgerald, and we spend time on Hemingway and other classic writers at the beginning of the class, and they're very thoughtful about going through the stories and picking out similes and figures of speech. And for instance, I taught a story called That Evening Sun by Faulkner, which is interesting divisions. You probably know this story. It's beautifully written with a wonderful opening paragraph and an ending. And then in between is a lot of dialogue,
Great
which is
dialogue, yeah.
not even that typical of Faulkner.
Right.
You know, it's not typical. It doesn't have the labyrinthine, long, clotted, typical Faulknerian prose at all. It's a very special story. So we talked about how it was put together, and the students are just so, kind of sharp-witted and thoughtful. Some of them had read The Sound and the Fury, so they could relate to the novel and how it relates to the story. So it's a very literary kind of experience, and I've always had students like that. I have never not had those students. There's always been a continuity, and that's probably the case with you too.
Yes, they care beyond all caring about what they're doing. There's a tiny little sequence in Dante, which he might have tweeted if he had the opportunity, where he uses a metaphor. He says he's watching some people in one bulge or other of the inferno, and he says he watches like one who throws away his life on birds, as in, I watch them as a bird watcher would watch birds.
Wow.
It's
That's
seemingly
beautiful.
tiny enterprise, a hobby.
Yeah.
If you have friends or if you're any bird watchers here, you know it is one of the most passionate endeavors that you can imagine people practicing. And that's the way the best students are.
Yes, it's very beautiful. It's very sort of mysterious. For instance, a few years ago, I had a student who just came into my workshop, and immediately I could tell this was a special person. He was very interested in experimental, literature like Kafka or Bruno Schultz and people like that. And then he turned out to be Jonathan Safran Foer, who's, very literary, but also very, very au courant, very contemporary and sort of speaking for his generation. And there's not always a person exactly like him because he's special, but there's always somebody in each workshop each year, or a couple, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, who are really different and unique and passionate. And they will turn out to be someone like Donna Tartt, who I guess was a great student at Bennington and started working on her.
Well, she ran with the wrong crowd at Bennington, but she ended up turning them into her first novel, so it
Yeah.
worked out okay.
And she's I don't know her, and I haven't read the new novel, but she sounds like the sort of person that comes along, in these generations where there's somebody who already at 18 or 19 is a writer.
Yes.
And then uses the material around her and sort of transmogrifies it.
We had great students at Bennington for a long period. I remember when Brett Ellis said, I have to go to New York next week, and his instructors, Joe McGinnis, said, what are you doing down there? He said, I've got to sign a contract for my first novel.
Was he your student?
Yes, and
Did you teach him everything he
no,
knows?
No, not everything. I think he learned a lot in the street. But Michael Pollan was a student of mine, and he's a wonderful writer. And we had people like that here and there in every class.
Well, at Princeton we have Jennifer Weiner, who's just enormously successful, and she writes kind of satirical comedy, kind of very clever novels, completely antithetical to Jonathan Foer, and yet they're all kind of involved in the same effort. And Alex Ganza, he's the creator. he's not the creator, but he's the American producer and writer of Homeland, and he was my student also. And Howard Gordon, I think, they were both my students. I can't lay any great claim to them because when they were my students, they were writing prose fiction, and this was many years ago.
But the thing about teaching people is that teaching does not mean, as you know, that period of time in which the class was taken. But I mean, if you teach long enough, you'll hear from someone 20, 30 years down the road, and they'll say, what you said to me in that tutorial in 19 whatever, it's changed my life. And you think, what did I say?
What did I say? Well, Alex Ganza tells this story, which I guess is true because I do like Saw Bell a lot. He was my student. He was writing a senior thesis, writing a novel with me. And he came in and he showed me his chapter. And I was really very gently critical of the students. I would sometimes say, I think this could be stronger. I think you could revise it or so. And I said to Alex, have you ever read this? And I gave him The Adventures of Augie March, Saw Bellow. And he had never read Bellow. And so he took a novel away and started reading it, and he completely fell in love with Saw Bellow, and he read all of Bellow. And if you watch Homeland, what is the name of Saul? And he called Saul Berenson is named after Saw Bellow. I thought that was really sweet. But you know, it's not that I taught Alex really anything literal, but I inspired him, I think, to read Saw Bellow.
What you're describing is what our mutual friend Nick Delbanco refers to as the old medieval craftsman tradition, where you have a master and you have a student, and the skills, the techniques of the art form are passed down from one generation to the next.
It's amazing. It's amazing to go on to Twitter, for instance, and see people responding to Homeland the way the students used to around the table when Alex was handing in his stories, except now there are millions of people responding, and he's on a rather higher level of exposure, and he makes a lot more money.
It was like that's the student of Robert Penn Warren's, David Milch, who went on to write Deadwood.
Oh, wow.
I mean, he was dubbed by Penn Warren as the student who was going to go on and make his name in literature, and he ended up doing westerns on cable.
I think maybe if Shakespeare were alive today, he might be drawn to that form because it's such a narrative form, and it's dramatic and cinematic. It's a form that would satisfy a lot of different qualities.
Yeah. I always get nervous when we start talking about movies because my daughter-in-law is an actress in the movies, and
what's her name?
Cara Seymour is the name she plays under.
Cara Seymour.
Commercial. Steven Soderbergh is making this new series called The Nick about a turn-of-the-century New York hospital.
Oh, wow.
And it opens on HBO in the fall. And
we'll be watching.
My daughter-in-law plays the Irish Catholic nun who runs the hospital, and Clive Owen plays the head of surgery. End of commercial. But I always worry when
Well, we all love hospital stories ever since ER went down the drain.
Yeah.
We're waiting,
Crichton is an interesting case because, he went through medical school and he had a perfect memory, eidetic memory, I guess they call it. So he was bored with his studies in medical school, can you imagine? And so he started reading detective novels and mystery stories and wrote one, almost on a lark, and it was bought, and he didn't take the money. He said, in exchange for me giving you this novel, he says will you have the director teach me how to make a TV movie? And he did 2 more of those.
That's
and
amazing.
then he started writing scripts, and he was a genius. He was 6'8", and a genius. He could have lived the rest of his life, which alas was cut off rather short, but he devised a computer-generated program that allowed movie companies to put in all the costs of a movie and basically produce a bill that they could show to investors. Here's how much we need for the camels. Here's how much we need for the actors. And I think that's still used out in Hollywood. But he he just loved to write above all else. He could have been a great researcher, medical researcher, a great physician, and he gave his life over to birds, except that he made a lot of money doing it.
And he did not live long. How did he die?
He died of cancer of the pancreas, I believe. And he knew.
I don't know much about his career.
Wonderful thriller writers, wonderful thrillers. Jurassic Park, He did all
I know
those.
the stories, but I don't know the prose fiction.
But he's one of the writers I love to read as a kind of, I love thrillers. I read them the way we used to have sorbet between courses in New Jersey at our dinners. Yes.
Well, thrillers and mystery novels are often used as vehicles for imparting information.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume that's Michael Crichton was doing that.
Yes, he did.
He was imparting lots of information.
Yeah.
And many detective novels are set in particular regions and that become very atmospheric and historical. P.D. James, for instance, is really very literary. And the Los Angeles noir writers, like Michael Connelly and James Elroy, and before that, Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, they're basically writing about L.A.,
Yes.
L.A. noir. And it's not a very different kind of writing that one would find in other parts of the country. So the mystery detective genre and the thriller genre are really vehicles, I think, for imparting all sorts of other qualities. The literary novel is supposedly in its own category because each literary novel is unique, supposedly.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a genre, it doesn't have a formula. And obviously it's not the case that each literary novel is unique, but I think that's the idea.
So genres have their purpose?
There's always been genres, and we all say the poetry genre of the sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet, the Petrarchan sonnet, the certain form with certain rhymes. And if you were a poet, you would naturally do these forms, and you would show, your genius. Shakespeare has many sonnets that are works of genius. And if you're working with genre, it can be very illuminating. It's not limiting. It's a way that you can illuminate what you're doing.
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, the sonnet extended the seriousness and legitimacy of love, deep passion.
Yes, the sonnet was considered like the little song. And then if you're a poet today and you're working with sonnets, you would probably have experimental sonnets that had varied rhymes or rhythms, or the sonnet might be longer or it might be short, you might break it up in different ways. But it would still be a sonnet in a sense. It would still have the properties of the sonnet. So that you have a form that you're working with, but you're also experimenting with it. And I think that's what we like about the genre. If I work with a genre of mystery, suspense mystery, I feel that it's a genre that I can experiment with, and I can have sentences and passages and characters that are not typically of the genre, but I sort of put them in that. And almost every work of fiction that I write of a certain length has a crime in it, some violation, some transgression.
Mm-hmm. Which has given you a kind of odd rep as the woman who writes about violence. But I think you've said this in interviews. I mean, when you've written as many thousands of pages as you have, there's bound to be trouble in it.
Yeah, that's true. Well, crime doesn't have to be violent, and mystery doesn't have to have bodies. Our lives are fraught with mystery. There are many mysterious things in our lives, and that they don't involve violence necessarily. In fact, the violence might be relatively direct and clear-cut, whereas the mysteries that surround us are just opaque.
Yeah. Well, when I want to calm myself, I read a serene book like the Old Testament.
Oh, wow.
Just,
Yeah.
I mean, you could...
Embattled.
Right,
Yes.
right. Are we ready for, I think I'm getting an eye signal about questions. We'd like to have as many questions as the next 10 or 15 minutes would allow. Yes, ma'am. Could you stand up and speak?
Yes, so first I want to thank you very much. Your writing has given me great
Oh, thank you.
for many, many years. I am curious to know, I don't think I need that. I am curious to know what your particular discipline is in the process of writing, your regimen, in other words.
My regimen?
If you have one, yes.
Well, I basically am so in love. I'm so in love with writing. I really am writing or thinking about my writing almost all the time. And so I particularly like to be working on, say, a chapter or a short story, and I'll go for a walk or run. I like to run, and when I'm alone, and I'm just sort of running and thinking, and I start trying to see the story in my mind like a movie, sort of, and envision it. But it's really important to be alone and not have interruptions. And so I find that very wonderful. And I really love to run, and I can get very misty-eyed and mystical about it. And then when I come back home, it's like some real work has been done, even though I haven't done anything, you know. And then I might take notes in longhand and just sort of write things down. And I'm working now on something in my head. I've been working on it for a while. Something had happened to my husband and me about 8 months, 10 months ago. And often in my writing, I'm sure it's true with Alan also, some little thing happens in your life and you keep bumping against it, wondering, what did that mean? But you don't really know. And so you keep coming back to it and think, well, I'm going to write a story about that. Not literally, but sort of about that.
Like, say, a stroll through a Chagall exhibit.
Yes. Or we came back home, we were living in Berkeley, and we couldn't get in the front door because someone had broken in the house and locked the front door from inside. And I remember that weird sensation when I couldn't get in my own house. I mean, that's a funny sensation. And just the feeling, oh, we shouldn't go in that house. Now, I know we shouldn't have done that because that's what we're always told. You never go in a house if you think someone's in there because you could get killed. Nonetheless, I just forgot that. I completely forgot all the wisdom and common sense, and I went around to the back of the house and could get in that door because the person hadn't bolted that door. And went in the house, and no one was somebody in the house. And I won't go into this weird experience, and my heart was pounding. But I just keep remembering that and always thinking, why did I do that? Because I know you're not supposed to do that. If the person in the house had a gun or panicked or had a knife, I could be killed. And yet at the time, I just somehow forgot that and just went in the house. It's like your property or your possessions, or you're anxious to get back in your house. And maybe to see, I wanted to say to myself, well, no, nobody's in there. You know, like, it's just a mistake, and it isn't really what you think. So I want to write a story about that experience, but I don't know how to tell the story. So when I'm alone and when I'm out walking, I keep thinking about the couple coming home and the house being locked, and I try to think of where will the story go? Now, you can steal the story if you want to. Anybody can have the story. It's out there in the world. It's
so
not.
You hardly ever say the truth to another writer.
Well, it's just that it's an example of how I can't find exactly how to tell the story. So each time I think about it, I'm thinking about some new way to tell it, and so eventually I'll get some way of doing it.
Here's a little.
So that's the answer to your question.
Little fact: David Halberstam's brother died in that way because he found somebody in his house in D.C.
Anyway, yeah.
Chased him out of the house and ran 4 blocks after him, and the guy finally turned around and in desperation took out his pistol and shot him dead.
Wow. It's not recommended to do. I lived for years in Detroit, Michigan, and there, I mean, wow, you'd never even go in your house. You know, just stay away from your house. But the whole idea of going in a house that maybe somebody's inside is just such a bad idea. And I'm curious too about why I did it and what happens to us in times of emergencies when
Mhm.
we're not thinking clearly.
Mhm. Another question. Yes, sir. Can you stand up, please?
Yes, you both alluded to this a little bit, but I'd like to see if you could elaborate a little bit more about writing as a way of knowing.
Mhm.
You sort of talked about that. Could you speak a little bit more?
Joyce?
about that? Do you write in order to know something?
Well, definitely, if you're interested in a subject and you read about it, that's a certain kind of knowledge. It's maybe somewhat glancing. If you're taking a course and you're studying for exams and writing papers in that subject, you will really learn it. You write a term paper and do research in something, you've absolutely gotten down to a deeper level than just reading about it. Then if you write a novel about it, you're really immersed in it. Because I've done a few historical novels, and there's nothing quite like the historical novel, because you're right, you're sort of in the milieu, and you show the way things looked and what people are wearing and the way they're talking and what's in the news and new inventions and developments, and as if you were right in it. And you learn enormously by doing that.
And you have to create the feeling of life in that time, which is what historians desperately try to do, and they learn that from novelists, but I think novelists do it better. Let's get a bumper sticker.
I did a lot of research for my novel, The Accursed,
Yes.
which is set in Princeton in 1905 and 06, and I was living in Princeton, so I could walk around. The houses are still there, all the old, beautiful, big estates, and the cemetery and the seminary and the Princeton University, old buildings. And so I can set my novel in a place that I can see. It's actually there, but it's back in time. And I did research into the life of Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the university, read his letters, read biographies about him, memoirs of people who knew him, so that you're very conversant, and then you enter into that time, and it's really magical. And I really felt, yeah, I'm right there. And the other evening in Princeton, there was a group of people met, and they talked about my novel in one of the houses on Library Place, one of the big old mansions that I write about in the novel. It was really, really, it was wonderful.
No disappearances after that?
No, but it's kind of interesting because the people who are living there now, of course, are not even descendants of the original owners. They're just people with a fair amount of money who bought these houses. But in the old days, in the 19th century and early 20th century, it was kind of a ruling class of aristocracy, you know, American untitled aristocracy. People who come over, whose ancestors came over in the Mayflower. They have a lot of money, and they lived in places like Princeton, and they had what they call the West End of Princeton, where there are these old houses that are built to resemble English country estates. You know, they're not as large as Downton Abbey, you know, but they're sort of like the idea, you know, of Downton Abbey on a small scale. And those houses are still there. And when you think of houses like that, the first thing you think of is they need a whole staff to run them. It's not the kind of household that belongs to an egalitarian society, but rather one that's very hierarchical. And then you think the next thing, well, what's the role of women in that society? So I wrote a lot about the role of women, because it was a time when women were just beginning, some women, to demand the vote and being campaigning to get the vote, which they would eventually get in a couple of decades. And it's sort of like American society was boiling shortly after the turn of the century.
The novel is history. Novel is time machine. Some good uses besides entertainment. Yes, way in the back.
Hi, I actually wanted to ask you about the role of women. I so remember reading you in college back in the, I never say this to anybody outside this room, but in the 1970s, women's consciousness raising classes and so forth. And you were, to me, you are a metaphor for that time. And of course, you continued very successfully. I'm curious to know if you liked that association back then, or if it was just put upon you, and how you feel women have progressed.
Oh, well, I identify very much with, I guess you could say, the feminist agenda and the energies of feminism. And I don't want to sound ridiculous, but I sort of identify with people who are a little bit downtrodden, you know, because I come from a world where people didn't have much money, and maybe like Scott Fitzgerald, I'm sort of looking from a distance at this aristocracy, the untitled aristocracy of rich people in America, and thinking of people with power, and just sort of examining the social situation that keeps that hierarchical, and looking at the ways in which women have definitely moved up, and the ways in which women are challenged, and how what I didn't think would happen, and I'm sure that's true of many women, and I'm sure that Alan is a feminist too, and many men I know are feminists. I think what we never anticipated was the successes that we made in the 1970s or 1980s, that they're always being challenged. You know, you think, well, now we're on a plateau. Say that we also have voting laws, you know, rights of voting. And you think, well, now we're on a plateau of civilization and equality. But that's not the case, because it's always being eroded.
Yeah.
It's almost like something's pulling it down. So that around the country there are people who are being disenfranchised from being allowed to vote for different reasons, for not having the correct IDs or the correct voter registration. And we never thought that sort of thing would happen. And it's the same thing was true with women's rights. But it's a wonderful time to be a woman writer. It started being so in the 1970s, because suddenly there was something called women's literature, and that didn't exist before. There was only, excuse me, Alan, when I say there was only mainstream white male writing was literature. And like women's literature didn't exist, or if it did, there were like a few women over here, like, well, Emily Dickinson, Willa Cather, you know, you can't complain because there's Willa Cather, and there's Edith Wharton, you know, that's enough. You know. Elizabeth Bishop, you know, it's very grudging, but then the stage was all crowded with male writers, and they were all white writers, and that got to be challenged as the decades went on. The great challenge of Richard Wright, for instance, with Native Son, a fantastic novel. That was a bestseller. Hard to believe it was a Book of the Month Club selection.
Slightly censored.
Slightly censored, but can you believe it?
No.
You know, to go from being a completely kind of blind or invisible, erased part of the culture to being a Book of the Month Club, a fantastic novel. And then after that, James Baldwin, who's one of the very great writers of the 20th century, then Toni Morrison.
Ellison, don't leave Ellison.
Oh, Ralph Ellison, of course. How could I forget Ralph Ellison? So these people came along kind of bursting, you know, just sort of bursting into consciousness. But before that, it would not have been so good. And before that time, there wouldn't have been, say, gay and lesbian writing was not acknowledged. There were maybe some underground classics, but there was no gay literature, and there was no really concerted, unified readership. There were no bookstores, and all that is really very, very much changed.
Yeah, I was just holding up a copy of the 50th anniversary edition of John Rechy's City of Night, which was considered really quite scandalous when it first came out.
Still scandalous. It's pretty rough.
Anyway, I want to say my bona fides. Each one of my wives was a feminist.
How many wives have you had?
3.
3 wives, wow. Way ahead of me.
All the people.
This woman here.
Yes, ma'am. Please stand up.
A very prosaic question. You talked about a Jewish grandmother.
Yes.
Were any of the people that followed that gave birth to you Jewish? Were they all Jewish or not, or mixed?
Well, it's an interesting and complex situation. I actually wrote about in a novel called The Gravedigger's Daughter. It's so complex. This part of the family came over from Germany, but they didn't want to say they were Jewish, and they just have a kind of amnesia. They never talked about it. My grandmother never talked about her background at all. She was a wonderful, wonderful person who lived for her children. She lived for her granddaughter. I was very spoiled. I was her favorite, and because of that, I've become a writer, I think, because of her. But she never told anything about herself, She's the kind of person who if you said, well, how are you? She'd say, oh, fine. How are you? And then she'd bring some food or she'd give some presents, and she's always giving me books. So I came away with a false idea of reality, really. I came away thinking that my grandmother was someone whom I knew. See, I didn't know her. I only knew a grandmother. I knew somebody who was playing a beautiful role with her family, but she must have gone home, and she must have been really lonely. She had no religious context. She had no one with whom she could talk about her own life. She didn't tell her own son, my father. She didn't tell him what her background was. So when I wrote my novel, I'm trying to create a person who is intensely lonely, but self-defined. And then my other side of my family, well, my father was her son. Now, he would have been Jewish, but he didn't know that he was Jewish. But he married my mother, who was Hungarian, of Hungarian descent. And let me tell you, the Hungarian side of the family is quite lively. We won't go into that. And there's a mixture of Irish in there. So you have Irish and Hungarian. You know, the alcoholism rate alone, the madness level, the suicide level, these are lively people. But the German Jewish strain, and here I'm sorry to talk in cliches, but this is the intellectual strain, you know. And I think, why do I read books and why do I love books? I think it's probably that inheritance. And forgive me for talking in racial stereotypes. I'm just trying to be funny. But there is something about German Jews and all Jews who revere books and education and language and art and music in a very, very wonderful way. Oh, and my grandmother paid for my piano lesson.
Yes, ma'am.
How much rewriting do you do? And when you're finished with something, are you really finished with it, or do you still want to fiddle? How do you know you're done?
Well, I rewrite a lot. As I said, I really love to write, and I'm so excited when I can write, and I love to rewrite. And so when I'm done with a novel, I just go back to the beginning and start going through it slowly and rewriting and adding things and subtracting things. So I can just do that now that we have word processors. You can do that a lot. You know, it becomes almost addictive. And it's basically a matter of time. So I finished a novel not too long ago, but I'm still going back and kind of lovingly going through it. And
That's what happened with The Accursed, wasn't it?
The
You put it
Accursed, I
aside for a
started
long time.
that. I finished that in 1984,
Mhm.
and it came out just this past year. So I wasn't working on it literally every minute, and but it was sort of in the other room, and I would go back and look at it. And in 1984, that was before, of course, before Obama's election. And because the novel's so much about race in America and racism and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and things like that, after the election of Obama and a whole new era, now fraught with ambiguity and ambivalence, I agree, but at the time of the election, there was a great deal of exuberance and excitement as a historical event. Then I felt I could go back to that novel and look at it again, because it's set in 1905, 06 in Princeton, a time of terrible racism and misogyny and sexism. But then to rewrite it in 2011 was a completely different experience.
I think we have time for just one more question, alas. Ah, yes, miss.